The boats in the yards throughout southern New England are quiet now. They're resting in their poppets and in the cradles, some covered from the winter's harshness. The boats will soon have their covers off, topsides polished, rigging installed and tuned, and more than a little work to smooth the bottoms. In a few months, they'll be ready to begin a new season, a time for racing and cruising. But that is a story for the future. This is a story of the past. It's the story of the Off Soundings Club, a sailing organization that began at the University Club in landlocked Springfield, Massachusetts in 1933. It began with 4 enthusiastic men who had a passion for sailing.
Mel Southworth and Stan Bradford and Tex Hopper and that Irving Johnson's brother Lawrence Johnson. They did a lot of homework up there in the Kimball Hotel, and that was really where the Off Soundings really born right there.
What is Off Soundings? The late Paul Van Dyke, past Commodore and race committee chair, explains.
It's a good event, and it's hard sailing and good racing and to the rules and everything else, but it's really for fun. The people, I think, enjoy each other. They enjoy the company. We get together both nights, Friday night and Saturday night. We award prizes to the first top 4 boats in each class.
From its first season in 1935, the club has conducted a spring and fall series. That series has always been held on the waters of eastern Long Island and Block Island Sound and on Gardiner's Bay.
Off Soundings, when you think of it, started from Springfield, and it was really a foreign organization coming to Mystic and Noank and New London, and a lot of people up inland came down here because of the temperature.
The earliest objective of Off Soundings mandates in the bylaws that seamanship over competition is the foremost purpose. Later that was amended to include promoting fellowship among persons actively interested in sailing. A dominant safety record has always been associated with Off Soundings. There has never been a major injury or fatality associated with any of the over 200 races. The reason for naming the club Off Soundings is not clear from the club's archives, but in nautical terms, the term Off Soundings means beyond the length of the old-fashioned lead line, a device used to measure the water's depth. To most sailors, it means offshore, beyond the continental shelf. To the contrary, however, the off-soundings races have always been conducted within a reasonable distance from shore. But those first members did sail offshore a few times in races like the Bermuda race, and likely were attracted by the term. This close-to-shore characteristic doesn't mean off-soundings is not a valuable racing venue. In reality, it has become a training ground for boats and crews that have sailed in many long-distance races. For some members, they may not like the so-called blue water racing and choose to stay on the bays and sounds and race in other around-the-marker races. Some boats in the fleet simply cruise all summer and just do off-soundings as their only race series. It was good for the founders in 1933, and it's good for those members sailing into the 21st century. Off-soundings members, whose numbers have reached over 600, like all sailors, have experienced a variety of conditions. Those conditions range from the perfect to race conditions nearing the extreme. Our principal asset to this club is the unparalleled documentation of its racing. With just a few years missing, no other sailing organization in the world can lay claim that every one of its races have been shot on professional 16mm movie film and more recently on 3/4-inch broadcast videotape. It's a collection unparalleled in the sailing community. All these films and tapes are housed at the Film and Video Division at Mystic Seaport Museum in Connecticut. To view all of this unedited footage would take over 4 24-hour days. From that archive, this program has been produced. Only a few scenes have come from other sources. Mystic Seaport's G.W. Blunt White Library also houses all the records, results, scrapbooks, race circulars, and yearbooks. The library bears the name of Blunt White, a longtime enthusiast of off-soundings and Mystic Seaport. The earliest race had as few as 9 boats in the spring and 8 in the fall. The first starting line was at Block Island, Rhode Island, with a small fleet at rendezvoused. On that race, the boat sailed to Greenport, New York the first day, and on the second sailed from Greenport to Duck Island Road off Westbrook, Connecticut. The yawl Diane, owned by G.W. Blunt White, was a winner in the first series.
The early days of off-soundings really were a cruise to Duck Island Roads and Shelter Harbor and Deering Basin. And they just, the few boats that they had were tied up alongside. And they had hot buttered rum for the gang right there, and everybody had their stove going.
The first movie film of off-soundings racing was shot by Mel Southworth in 1937. In the late 80s, his daughter donated all the film her father had shot to Mystic Seaport. By 1949, the club officially started shooting film of every race as a matter of routine. This race from 1937 shows a variety of period vessels that represent off-soundings membership. In this race, the boat started at New London, sailed west and rounded the Cornfield Light vessel moored off the mouth of the Connecticut River. Then the boats headed southeast through Plum Gut and finished near Deering Harbor at Shelter Island, New York. On the second day, they started near Greenport, sailed Gardiner's Bay, passed through Plum Gut, and finished at Duck Island Roads near Westbrook, Connecticut. In these early days, the races were run on Saturday and Sunday. Later, that was changed to Friday and Saturday racing. Up to 1960, the United States Coast Guard cooperated as part of its seamanship initiative and provided a cutter to act as race committee boat for almost every race in both spring and fall. When a Coast Guard cutter was not available, this beautiful schooner took the times as the boats crossed the finish line. The fall series of 1938 was canceled when in mid-September, the hurricane of '38 struck the eastern seaboard.
In late September, nature again rebelled. A West Indian hurricane, without warning, raked the Atlantic coastline. Hundreds of lives were lost. Homes, farms, land and sea transportation were demoralized and destroyed. The New England states were hardest hit. Thousands were rendered homeless by the fury of angry nature. A $150 million hurricane, the East's worst tropical storm.
A report issued by the club gave some indication of the damage the fleet had sustained. Despite the damage and destruction to the boats in the fleet by the hurricane of '38, 76 boats showed up for the starting line in 1939. Over the course in those early years, the sailors saw some unforgettable sights. These were the waning days of coastal schooners. The shore party has always been the most gratifying social event for off-soundings. The first was held with 75 sailors on the steamer dock at Block Island. The party remains a time for friends to get together. The earliest crocks to serve the drinks in bulk were nothing more than big teapots, then kettles. Later, the types of dispensers for drinks varied greatly. What's more interesting is the drinking sometimes guided the race course.
Off soundings always used to go to have our party when we used Shelter Island as a race destination at the Shelter Island Yacht Club. And we had our habitual crocks that have been in use for many, many years with off soundings, and to which we could mix our own drinks and have our own party. But along about in there, one of the hierarchy at Shelter Island Yacht Club decided we couldn't use the crocks anymore. They'd sell us bar drinks by the drink. So we decided to go one night to 3 Mile Harbor, Maidstone Marina base, run by the Dragon Lady. And we stayed there a few years, and finally Shelter Island saw the light.
The boats had some good sailing, but as today, the wind is pretty unpredictable. The last race of fall, 1941, when 57 boats were entered, would spell an end to off-soundings racing until 1946. Little more than 2 months after the 1941 Fall Series, the United States entered World War II. When the war ended, it took about a year to get the government to lift the restrictions that it set on the waters of Long Island and Block Island Sound and on Gardiner's Bay. In 1946, the races began again. By 1947, off-soundings was up to 73 starters. By 1949, that figure was topped by 112 entries. The early 1950s show Montauk Harbor on Long Island as the first day's destination. The boats repeated a pre-war course. Later in the 50s and 60s, and most of the 70s, 3 Mile Harbor was added as an alternative to Montauk as the first day's destination. The course to Montauk was lengthened by sending the boats off from Sarah Ledge off New London, past a nun near Race Rock Light, east to an MOA flasher off Watch Hill, and then across to Round Cerber Shoal and on to the finish line off Montauk. The smaller, slower boats stayed west and observed Valiant Rock, sailed to a rounding of Shagwong Reef, and went on for the finish line. To reach 3 Mile Harbor on the first day, the larger, faster boats left from Sarah Ledge, past the Red Nun at Race Rock Light, across the Sound to Cerber Shoal, rounded that and ran into Gardiner's Bay, observing 1 GI at the ruins, onto a Red Nun off Sag Harbor, and then on to the finish line off 3 Mile Harbor. The smaller boats made their course shorter by not having to round Cerber Shoal. The boats would stay the night in Montauk or at 3 Mile Harbor, and then the Saturday race offered a few courses conducted on Gardiner's Bay. The favorite second night finish line was off Greenport, and then the boats would stay the night at Deering Harbor and have the shore party at the Shelter Island Yacht Club.
Off soundings had its own measurement rule, almost pioneered in it as a rule that could be done very inexpensively and worked pretty well. A lot of it was laid out over the years by Harry Scheel and yours truly, and we have a data bank almost incomparable to anybody of the data that can be originated very simply and cheaply. And it was used right up until the advent of PHRF. In fact, we still have our data bank and we still use it.
Wisely, the early founders of off soundings realized, well, if we're going to use a simple rule, we need to make some corrections. And that led into the penalty situation, which exists from the very beginning up until today, where if you win a race, the next race you have a penalty of 15%. If you get a second, 10%, and a third, 5% for a two-day series. But the concept is go with a simple rule and make it more difficult for he who wins to win again, or he's got to be a lot better.
A few of the boats in the fleet still carried the gaff rig and fared well in race results. As boat builders and designers were getting more comfortable with changes in boat building materials mandated by the war, a different kind of boat was beginning to show up. Boats were getting lighter, and for the time being that was accomplished by using plywood and some use of fiberglass. 1952 shows a clear shot of a boat that will become a staple in off-soundings racing until the late 1990s. Dolphin, a Newport 29 owned by the Lockwood family, was designed and built by Nathaniel Harrisoff in 1914. It joined the fleet in 1947. On hand to take still pictures during this period was Morris Rosenfeld. His boat, Photo, was pictured dozens of times in races throughout the 1950s and early 60s. The 1952 records show Class A started with 29 boats, A2 with 31, B with 35, 10 showed for the line in Class C, and schooner class also had 10 starters. Another boat making its first appearance in the films in the late 1950s is Ed Raymond's Shantyman. This remarkable little boat may not have been spotted in the off-soundings films before 1957, but Ed was no stranger to attention, as is proved by this post-war Paramount newsreel.
Boats can do more than just win races. They can provide a means for relaxing from the everyday cares of dry land. Like this 32-foot overall ketch, the Shantyman. It's a seagoing home for an entire family, with a small fry wrapped in a life jacket. She has won long-distance races, but between times, she just cruises. The father of these kids, the owner of the Shantyman, is a leading skipper on Long Island Sound, where the ketch is a familiar summer sight.
Ed Raymond went on to sail Shantyman in off-soundings until he died in 1992. For many years, the captain of this able ketch was the head of the protest committee.
Our Soundings Club, over the years, has had great use of the rules, runs by the rules, but is not prone to giving protests to each other. One of the reasons our protest committee chairman, Ed Raymond, was so good at this, he'd look at somebody and he'd look over his glasses and say, "You don't really want to protest, do you?" And the protest would invariably get withdrawn. Considering there's up to 200 boats racing, it's remarkable.
Of all the moving images in this collection, and all the categories that were selected for this program, the one that repeatedly seemed to create the most frustration for owners and crew was the one labeled Spinnaker. The Spinnaker makes sailing more fun for the go-fast boaters. It is beautiful to see on the horizon, or even on one boat. But the technique, timing, the precision in getting the Spinnaker up and down is always a challenge. The problems with Spinnakers have likely generated the most colorful one-sided discussions between boat owner and crew. As the 1950s ended, all boats had Spinnakers made of nylon. The transition was part of a steady movement after the war. Although nylon was used and perfected for parachutes during the war, it took manufacturers little time before they started producing a material with a tight enough weave for sails. Mainsail and jib material was all cotton before the war, but after new synthetics made a move into sails. Disappointing results were seen from the first nylon mains and jibs. Then for a couple of years, Vignon and then acrylic Orlon were tried, before polyester Dacron sails started showing up in the early 1950s and took hold as the decade proceeded. Stu Hotchkiss joined Off Soundings in 1953, but a lot of his sailing was done as crew for Rod Stevens, the brother of boat designer Olin.
Well, I'm not exactly sure how many years it is, but it goes back before World War II, and then in 1946, when Rod Stevens bought Mustang, I sailed regularly with him, and I've been sailing quite regularly ever since 1946.
A sailor really doesn't get very far without a crew. They become an essential element of sailing. They handle just about every chore known. In recent years, the number of crew members has grown. The move toward fiberglass boats in the 60s was gradual. The early boats shown in the films were in Class B, the smaller craft. It wasn't until the later 60s that larger boats began appearing in glass. In 1961, the Coast Guard would no longer offer a cutter as a committee boat. So Henry B. DuPont, who had already been actively sailing his 48-foot Pacific Coast class Cyane and a newer Sparkman and Stevens designed Cyane, offered Nor'easter as a committee boat. Nor'easter is a 58-foot William Hand motorsailor built in 1924. From 1961 and for 15 years, Nor'easter was the committee boat of record. It became a signature of Off Soundings. As the 1960s continued, some pretty vintage boats remained in the fleet. The Fisher's Island 23, the R boats, S boats, the Buzzards Bay 25, still a gaff rig or two. Even a few of the unusual joined the fleet. Boats that may take half a gale to make them go. This boat, Branderis, is a Dutch, shallow draft, lee-board cutter rig. The boat appears in pictures for numerous races up to 1969. Other interesting boats show up. In the early 1960s, the boats stopped going to Shelter Island and its beautiful Deering Harbor. The second night of racing was replaced with a stay at 3 Mile Harbor.
After Off Soundings made the move from Shelter Island, as talked about before, we discovered a nice place to have our rendezvous in 3 Mile Harbor in a spot called the Maidstone Marina, which was sort of a little puddle carved out of the mainland, run by a very colorful lady known as the Dragon Lady. I think her real name was Mrs. Palmer. In any event, it was quite satisfactory. Most boats anchored out in the middle of 3 Mile Harbor and launched in, but those that went into her marina, it was ideal in there, with one exception. When the tide was low, you couldn't get in or out, and that was kind of a drawback. But we enjoyed the 3 Mile Harbor, and we stayed there until Shelter Island said uncle and wanted us back.
The shore party in the 1960s featured dozens of sailors, but Off Soundings, like almost every other sailing organization, continued as a male attraction. The role of women was passive.
When we first started racing in Off Soundings, there just weren't that many women there. Most of us were wives of boat owners, or at least our husbands made us think that maybe we were sharing a partnership in this boat ownership. But there just weren't that many women out there sailing. Basically, it was a male stronghold. There were a few of us who raced aboard regularly, but a lot of the women came over on the ferry just for the party, and they missed out. What happened was just a good time, and we looked forward to spring and fall just because we all got together, and we saw people from various areas up and down the Sound that we never saw regularly.
1970 revived an old destination for the races.
Location of the off-soundings rendezvous, i.e. end of the races, we were always interested in finding new courses for the fleet. Sometimes those new locations were not of our own volition. The pollution issue became a problem, and New York State took a very aggressive approach to pollution, saying that no one could be in their waters unless they had holding tanks or treatment devices. Back then, this was just in its infancy, and we had a decision to make with off soundings whether we would violate those rules of no discharge or treatment, and naturally we had to get out of New York State because we didn't want to put anyone in the fleet in jeopardy.
The docking headquarters for the Friday jump-off for the races became Noank and Stonington because of their closeness to the starting line off Watch Hill. It was also about this time that the Off Soundings Board of Governors permitted the introduction of the cruising canvas class. This class was intended for owners that simply didn't want the hassle of flying a spinnaker. From that point forward, the cruising canvas class has grown in size and was bound to the same course as the smaller boats. The fall start in 1970 was plagued with fog, which became a consideration in many of the races to and around Block Island. The air on that first race was unimpressive, but the greeting at Block Island was encouraging. After a good night in the Great Salt Pond at Block Island, the sailors were ready for a better day. The Saturday racing of the series was much more promising. The early racing to Block Island offered about the same course as today. All the boats sailed from the start, just east of Watch Hill, around the red and white Whistle Buoy off Watch Hill. Then the smaller boats and cruising canvas boats continued to 1BI off the northern tip of the island. They would round that buoy and go on to the finish line off the Great Salt Pond. The larger boats going around the MOA Whistle would proceed to Nebraska Shoal, round that Red Nun, and go on to the finish line. The boats in the 1960s and 70s began to take on a new look under the waterline as well as above. Lighter displacement was the most obvious, but under that waterline the boats were beginning to get flatter bottoms or harder chines, highlighted by short, deep, fin keels and separate rudders. This was a big change from the full, long keel boats of before.
Our soundings always classified their vessels, because almost all of them the same underbody, together. At one point we decided that since the rule won't work properly no matter what for these fin keel spade rudder things, we started classifying them into separate classes, and there was quite a significant event. We now started with 1 C class. We're now up to 5 C classes. We used to have 5 A and B classes. We're now down to 2. Sign of the times.
A local designer, Bob Evelyn, exhibited his new boat, Pointing Star, in 1975 at the Spring Off Soundings. The boat was light and fast, but in the fresh breeze suffered rudder damage, but despite that, finished first. It was only in the early 1970s that sail numbers became more consistent and useful for spotting. Before that, many boats had no numbers at all on the sail, and that made identification for the race committee difficult. Therefore, the racing instructions required that every boat would carry a large card with a number assigned to each boat for that race. While going over the finish line, the card would be displayed and the boat's standings recorded by the race committee. In 1976, the late Peter Sanger's new fiberglass schooner is sighted, and exhibits just some of the variety always in the fleet. That same year, West Maxwell's 60-year-old S-boat Phryne was sailed successfully. It seems the New York State regulations regarding overboard discharge from boats was a federal matter, and like Rhode Island, New York now decided not to enforce it. So in 1977, Off Soundings decided to return to Long Island for one race series a year. New London was happy about the decision. That return was also greeted on Long Island with enthusiasm. 1977 meant another change. The death of Henry DuPont Jr. in 1970 and then his son's death in 1977 meant the loss of Nor'easter as a race committee boat. Greater expense for the club was incurred with the charter of Empress. Empress was promoted as a portable committee boat for hire. It had been used for the America's Cup Challenge and Defender trials, as well as many other races along the East Coast. Aboard Empress, meals were provided, as well as several staterooms. Therefore, some overnight accommodations ashore and meal expenses for the race committee could be reduced. When Off Soundings returned to Long Island, the course remained pretty consistent over the next years. The boats would all leave from the starting line at Sarah Ledge off New London. The larger, faster boats would stay close to Fisher's Island. Then they sailed to and rounded Cervera Shoal and entered Gardiner's Bay, observing 1 GI at the ruins, and on to the finish line at an MOA buoy off Greenport. The other classes went west, passing Valiant Rock, and entering Gardiner's Bay, sailed on to the finish line. In recent years, however, the courses have been altered, so all classes pass Valiant Rock, and once in Gardiner's Bay, sail various courses, depending on the class, using the traditional finish line. The late 70s showed a new material, mylar, being used for main and jib. The shore party continued as an opportunity for all sailors to get together and discuss the day's race, have a drink, or just act a little foolish. Credit for shooting the film up to 1983 goes to Mel Southworth, Dr. Meyer, Agnew Fisher, Alfred F. Loomis, Norman Fortier, Peter Converse, Monk Gordon, Roger Epley, and a few others. Up to this time, the camera had caught many scenes, including these varied subjects. Here in 1955, the light air causes a close confrontation between two boats. A schooner storms across the finish line in 1957. A torn main. A broken mast in 1973. Another lost mast that same year. Here is a boat grounded on the flats off Shelter Island Yacht Club in Deering Harbor. In 1975, Betty Betty tears the jib. 1976, a tight collision at the starting line. Whoops, this boat didn't estimate the tide right when rounding Nebraska Shoal. A little gouge is easily fixed. In 1983, Nor'easter, now owned by John Helm, returned to Off Soundings as a stake boat, patrol and camera boat, and carrying the on-call doctor for Off Soundings. In that same year, all the earlier Off Soundings films were donated by the club to Mystic Seaport. Since 1983, the museum's camera operator, Ken Mahler, has shot most of the races. As historian, Bill Ames has helped Mystic Seaport in the presentation of the Off Soundings program at the club's awards banquet. Bill describes for viewers the names and events that surround the yearly series. In fall 1984, the first day of racing from Watch Hill was lumpy and wet. Those usual problems with spinnakers were enhanced by the fresh breeze and miserable cold weather. Even the usual perfect sailor, Ed Raymond, aboard Shantyman, had trouble with his spinnaker that day. The Saturday race was canceled when the wind piped up. Boats tried to leave, but many returned after seeing what was in store for them outside the Great Salt Pond at Block Island. In 1986, with donations from Off Soundings members and memorials, Mystic Seaport made the switch from 16mm film to 3/4-inch broadcast videotape. Now the edited programs could include sound as recorded on the race course, music, and Bill Ames' narration. In the early 80s, the fleet was experiencing the J-24 class boats. This light displacement, fast-moving, user-friendly boat in future years was to be joined by many others of its class. The video shows a long-standing Class B favorite, Ed Purcell's Just Friends. A boat like this is the shortest length allowed to race in Off Soundings. That limit has an interesting story.
The Off Soundings rule and the Off Soundings rules allowed any vessel to race in our races that had the accommodations you could sleep in, you could eat in it, you could go to the head in it, etc. But we determined pretty early on that the measurement rule didn't work if vessels were too small. They were unfairly advantaged. So we picked a lower limit of 23 3/4 feet. That happened because Rod Stevens was coming out with the Dolphin, the 24-foot Dolphin at this point, and brought up the fact that we couldn't stick with 25, so we elected 23 3/4 feet. The upper size, 62 feet, is still the case, and that happened to a similar event that Pierre DuPont's Barlovento was 62 feet long. Things were that simple.
The Coast Guard Academy boats have participated in Off Soundings since the early years. Here, CGA-5 is seen under some pretty fine sailing conditions. When the Off Soundings pictures switched from film to video, a small 8mm video camcorder was purchased for use on the committee boat. It was intended to bring a different view for shots there. This camcorder also captured the first boats getting the gun at the finish line. The broadcast camera was usually located at the stake boat end of the starting line and missed occurrences happening near the committee boat. Here is a perfect example of that camera in use. Bill Ames shoots the start of Class A1 in spring 1987, the 50th anniversary for Off Soundings. Although a little jumpy, the video shows some pretty enthusiastic barging at the start. The fall series in 1987 was windy and rainy. After being unable to get a race line set off Watch Hill, Larry Jacobson, new to being race committee chair, called off the race. After the cancellation, the race committee boat Empress, the camera boat, and some of the Hardy fleet headed for Block Island, hoping to have racing there the next day. Upon arriving at the island, the conditions did not improve as the boats staggered in. By Saturday, conditions had worsened. The lost race day became a day for the crews and owners to visit on the island, fiddle about the boat, or hang out at Champlin's Marina and watch a little TV and dream of racing another day. In 1988, Off Soundings returned to Watch Hill. The Board of Governors decided to reverse the racing venues. The course to Block Island would be in the spring now, and in the fall, the boats would rendezvous at Deering Harbor at Shelter Island. Also this year, Mystic Seaport added a gyro-stabilized lens to its equipment list. This lens was to present a new dimension to pictures shot on the water. In the past, the boat on which the camera operator was taking pictures had to get in close to get a full shot. Now the camera boat could stay away from the starting line or the boat being photographed and use the telephoto gyro-stabilized lens to bring these shots in close and stable. No matter what the design, displacement, or sail material, the fact remains the captain and crew make the difference in getting off the starting line first and making it to the finish to get the gun. The crew on the boat make up a team to get things done right, fast, and safely. When it's all over for the day, the crew likely parties the most and sleeps the soundest. But for them, the entire experience should be a lot of fun. For the owners, the same could hopefully be said.
There's no question that off soundings provides an ideal training ground for crew and crew development. I remember when I came back after years in the service and at graduate school and got sailing again in off soundings with Elliot Porter, the stories that he would tell of the number of skippers that he sailed under and what it meant to him in terms of training as good crew and eventually skipper. We try, I think, all of us to carry on that tradition, bringing in new and younger members as crew in hopes of them coming along, getting up to the skipper and race eventually.
As the 1980s continued, newer designs were added to the fleet. Several classes were beginning to take on the look of boats typical in Grand Prix regattas elsewhere.
There's greater intensity in the racing now than in the early days. I think that we can all come up with different answers as to why that might happen. However, my instinct is that the world we live in runs at a much more intense competitive pace than in earlier days, and consequently that sort of behavioral pattern is apparent in our yacht racing.
On Saturday in the Fall Series 1989, the wind blew as high as 45 knots in usually sheltered Gardiner's Bay, and it was as choppy as any sailor had seen it in some time. Photographing from the stable camera platform aboard Freedom, Mystic Seaport photographer Maria Smith caught the best shots of off-soundings boats in heavy air using the gyro-stabilized camera. The race went on, and the scenes give testimony to the hair-raising race it was. The beginning of the last decade of the 20th century started with light air and quiet seas off Watch Hill. Frank Boland's Tatler almost got hit when another boat, not realizing the set of the tide, slipped down very close to Tatler's topsides. This race was like too many for sailors. It was light air. Rounding the Nun at Nebraska Shoal, which is positioned just a few miles west of Point Judith, Rhode Island, and standing just 2.5 miles off the smooth Rhode Island shoreline, was a frustration and maybe embarrassment for some boats turning the mark and heading for Block Island in the finish. The urge to do well is strong on any off-soundings boat. For that reason, it wasn't surprising that over the years, the camera has caught very few youngsters as primary crew aboard the boats. This scene in spring 1990 aboard Jack Rose is an exception. Also in this scene, the owner's wife plays an active role in helping the young crew member. Another advantage for new boats was their ability to pivot quickly on their short, deep keels. Here, tighty paws makes a perfect tack in good air. The fall race of 1990 brings a perfect example of the ability of the newly designed boats being capable of turning fast. Here, the spinnaker on Wes Maxwell's Bob Evelyn designed Fifi is fouled. Responding instantly, Wes plunges the boat into a 360-degree turn and clears the spinnaker. In this same race, a shot is caught by the camera which suggests that this crew member came close to slipping over the side. Just a few minutes later, the camera catches this shot of jarred loose, nearly on its side while overpowered with the spinnaker. In 1991, Mystic Seaport's 61-foot schooner Brilliant, designed by Olin Stevens and built by Henry B. Nevins in 1931, was invited by the Off-Soundings Board to take part in the races. Brilliant was at the extreme of length allowed into off-soundings races. Brilliant added to the fleet a companion for the older wooden boats still sailing and performing well. Dolphin had remained in the fleet as a constant competitor from the earliest days. Another wooden boat in the racing is Spindrift, planning to sail into the 21st century with off-soundings. Spindrift was sailing with its owner in the 1941 off-soundings. The boat was built in Bristol, Rhode Island by the Harrisoff Manufacturing Company in 1927 and was part of a class known as the Fisher's Island 31. The Concordia is a class of wooden boat that has graced off-soundings from the early 1950s. This beautiful yawl was carefully laid out by Waldo Howland, the former owner of the Concordia Company of South Dartmouth, Massachusetts. Most of the Concordias were built in Germany. Constructed of fiberglass, sail number 655 became a classic on the off-sounding circuit. Wimbrel was owned by past Commodore Jack English. The 47-foot boat was first spotted in the 1981 race series and sailed into the late 1990s. In 1990, the race committee boat Empress was no longer available for hire when Bill Thomas, the owner, retired. Nor'easter had been sold by John Helm to a new owner. The race committee was fortunate in using Freedom as race committee boat from 1990 to 93. Freedom, a large and comfortable power yacht, was owned by a past off-sounding sailboater, Harry Elliott. In the spring of 1993, a new design shows up on the line. This Rodney Johnstone creation sports a bowsprit that can extend and retract. The unusual jib gives the boat a lot of sail area. It moves very fast on certain points of sail. That same year, past Commodore Bill Gunther's Froya, a McCurdy Rhodes 47 sloop, is first spotted and presents a tall mast on the horizon of off-soundings boats. Many other owners were sailing and enjoying the racing venue with their boats that keep the spirit of off-soundings alive. In 1992, the club broke precedent and elected Eileen Ames, its first female honorary member, for her work serving on the race committee, the mountainous clerical work she had overseen, and her years with the organization of the annual awards banquet. Also that year, the board asked 2 other wooden boat classics to join the racing. Neath, owned by Jack Brown of Texas, was invited to bring his 1905 Harrisoff. This fabulous sloop, of which only one was built, was fully restored and became the oldest boat sailing in the races. The other boat invited was Sailboat, an Augie Nielsen designed, Paul Luke built 51-foot yawl. For many off-soundings members, the introduction into the racing of Sailboat brought back memories of a sister ship, Seaflower, sailed in the 50s and 60s by member Steve Castle. In 1993, off-soundings again broke with tradition and elected Sailboat's owner, Queenie Hooper Foster, the first boat-owning, dues-paying female member. Since that time, several other female members have been elected to membership. In 1993, Nor'easter, the superb motor sailor originally owned by Henry B. DuPont Jr., was now owned by his grandson, Henry. Nor'easter returned to off-soundings as race committee boat. The boat had been completely rebuilt and brought to the races a great tradition and a beautifully restored icon. In the fall of that year, race committee chair Wes Maxwell convinced the committee to try something new. The boats would sail Peconic Bay instead of Gardiner's Bay for the Saturday race. Always known for its fresh breeze and quiet waters, the race this year was plagued by fast-moving tides around one particular mark. Later in the day, the race suffered from a lack of wind. This was the last year the new course was attempted, and the boats returned next fall to the traditional waters of Gardiner's Bay. In that next fall, the race committee altered the courses and routine. High-performance classes were instructed to participate in 2 shorter races, while other classes would run a slightly modified race course. In spring 1995, another newly restored traditional wooden boat re-entered off-soundings racing. The boat had raced many years earlier. Rogue is a variation of the Newport 29, the same class as the traditional off-soundings competitor Dolphin. In the fall of 1995, the race committee invited 12 meters to join the racing in Gardiner's Bay. The 12s were to be joined by others from Newport, but only Fiddler and Fury showed. A couple of short races were conducted, and then the boat started and overtook the off-soundings fleet on the normal course. The 12-meter class are about 68 feet in length. The 92-foot masts tower above the regular class racers. The crossing of Long Island Sound by Valiant Rock Buoy is usually safe, but always a passage advising caution. In the fall 1996 series, the crossing was way out of the ordinary, with the tide running fast. The boats thought they could run to the mark from the starting line off New London. But as they neared the buoy, the current was stronger and the chop was great. For a few moments and a few boats, it was a scary time. Spring 1997. Only the home video camcorder was there that series. The course to Block Island was rainy, but the wind was good. On Friday, the fleet proceeded directly to Block Island. There, special marks were set in the lee of the island where the sea was not so choppy. The next day was nice and the racing around Block Island was good. The fall 1997 race was uneventful. Beautiful weather conditions, but no air on Friday and okay air on Saturday made for a quiet end to the season.
It's beautiful out on the water. You forget all your stresses in life. And that's why I love it so much.
Whoa! I'll drink to that.
He'll drink to anything.
Today was nice. Yesterday was bad. Thank you.
In getting away for a day or two, even though we don't go all that far, we get away from home and the trials and tribulations of business and the everyday life and focus entirely on 2 days of racing. So that even though it's only a couple of days, it's a real break in the regimen of life. And that also has been a very special aspect. To be able to get that break in the spring and the break in the fall has meant a lot to us.
In spring 1998, the gyro camera from Mystic Seaport was not on the race course again. Bad weather was expected and engine trouble sent the camera boat back to Noank. Bill Ames with the camcorder, however, was there. On Saturday, a race was held in the lee of Block Island. The rain poured and the wind blew and the boats moved. The owner of Phoenix was interviewed at the fall race and had a philosophical outlook on the windy spring off Block Island.
The spring series was good. That was fun.
Oh, you like that?
Yeah, it was really blowing.
I wasn't there. Wait a minute.
If you think about it, in San Francisco, I mean, people sail in heavy air all the time.
I like sailing in the rain.
Heavy air is fun, and rain and big wind.
Oh, yeah.
Although you have to rest, especially when you're our age, as you can see.
So we're resting.
We're resting.
Well, off soundings as a whole, I think, in my point of view anyway, it's been so successful and so much fun. And number one, it is so professionally run by amateurs. The handicapping is fast, accurate, everybody's proud of it, and it was fun.
The fall 1998 Friday race was an example of great racing. The sky was gray, but the air was fresh as the boats ran with spinnakers in Gardiner's Bay. An old name, but a new boat for owner Ed Purcell. Just Friends runs up Gardiner's Bay wing and wing, catching the air just right. The Saturday race at Gardiner's Bay started with light air and close starts. Later in the day, the wind increased a little and made for some good sailing. The talk of the party that fall night at the Shelter Island Yacht Club was the pile-up at a special mark to the north near the ferry dock at Orient Point. At that mark, the wind went very light.
This is a story you hear when it works. When it didn't work, it was all bad luck.
and I thought it was going to be the worst thing in the world. And suddenly, we went around and we were clear. And we just sailed away.
In all the roundings, at all the marks, in all the off-soundings history, this one caught on videotape was one of the tightest. Many sailors later said, we ignored little collisions and just shook hands with our neighbor and prayed we'd get through and nobody would protest. The last races for off-soundings in the 1900s took place on June 11th and 12th. The 8mm camcorder was there on the committee boat to record some images.
Where to go, Bert?
The fall race in 1999 was canceled. The threat of Hurricane Floyd was too great.
You have to remember that Off Soundings for years has been an innovator in many aspects of small boat racing. Our rule was the rule of choice in most inshore handicap racing until PHRF came along. In terms of safety, we introduced a number of requirements, including self-bailing cockpits and the like. The format of the race itself was something of an innovation when it came along. So we're used to innovation, but we also appreciate tradition. We will be trying to adhere as much as possible to that in the future. That doesn't mean that we're not going to be looking at change. What kind of change is a little bit hard to nail down at the moment, but we are, for example, continually reviewing venue, just where we're racing and when we're racing. We're going to be introducing some changes that are sensitive to time available to all of us today. Family racing, more significant involvement of women and the family racers. There's always the question of multi-hull versus mono-hull. So we're used to innovation, but we also appreciate tradition.
I've been asked what would my memories of off soundings be if it were all of a sudden canceled forever and a day. And certainly I think the whole idea of racing with friends and against friends is the whole concept that would be a great loss to me, and I think to many, many. Obviously, I'm not alone in that feeling of loss if that were to happen.
When you think back on off soundings, you can think to a lot of less than ideal weather conditions, both light and heavy. You can think to some special boats you were on, but what you really remember were the people that were involved in the events. And for as long as I've been involved, it's the gathering of friends that really has meant the most to me.
What will the future bring? New boat building materials, sail material beyond Kevlar, overwhelming technology, electronics. Whatever, the future will bring people in friendly competition. We end our look of the 1900s with a look at just a few of the many faces of the members of Off Soundings, their faithful crew, and their beloved boats.
So if you look off down the road, I think that in sum total, the tradition of the club will be maintained, and the tradition of the club is one of change as change is needed. And I think that's essential to long-term maintenance of the strength and viability of this club, as it is at so many other organizations.
washer and dryer automatic? You got enough people on that packet to pick it up and carry it over the finish line. Well, then it's not an able slave, then. Look at the bundle!